method of construction, and the other is in how they do the rib, and in, of course, in the material they use for the floaty part. So we start with a size 10 hook. This is a Hanek H330BL, and it's in a size 10. I've tied a couple of those patterns down to in size 12. I think when you get down to 14, the snowshoe is going to be a little harder to tie because of the bulk of the material. And the other thing that'll happen when you get down to below 12 is you're going to have to change from hare's ear dubbing to something that's a little more soft, doesn't have the sharp hackle fibers, in order to make the base of the fly at the very back end skinny enough. So we'll start with the snowshoe hair. And the snowshoe hair one is this guy here. The body is hare's ear dubbing, the abdomen's hare's ear dubbing, and that's it there, standard hare's ear dubbing. That's the natural, which is the thorax, sorry, the abdomen. And then the thorax is this darker stuff. It's a chocolate brown, just to provide a thorax that's a little darker. And the wing, or the floaty part, is these guys, which is the foot off of a snowshoe rabbit. And why you say snowshoe rabbit? Well, these guys hop around on the snow, and in order to avoid their feet sticking to the snow, the material in the very base of the foot is water resistant. And that's why this thing floats like a cork, because the fur that's in here is water repellent. Water doesn't get into it, and it doesn't, certainly when it freezes, it doesn't stick to it. So that's, we're going to take it. Now the snowshoe hair, you're not taking it off the top or the sides. You're going to take it off of the bottom where there's lots of fur, to not only help them float on the snow, but also to keep their feet warm. So when we do this guy, we start with some light colored thread. And the YouTube video that I saw initially, he used white, but I'm going to use a very light tan. And this is a 140 denier. I'm going to start right behind the eye. And I'm going to wrap down the hook. So that I've got that thread nice and cinched on there. And then I'm going to go right down to the end. Cover the hook shank all the way down to the end. Now I think Bob Wyatt did this way in order to make it simple or quick to tie. Starts at the bottom, and then he comes back up. So that whole business there is, I think, to help keep the dubbing intact without spinning around the hook too much. And then what he does is he starts with dubbing the body on, and this is, again, it's actually, this is the stuff I've got is a blend of hare's ear and Antron, which makes it a little easier to dub. And one of the things I discovered in doing these, to get a nice tight body, it really helps to have a little bit of dubbing wax on the thread. So I put some dubbing wax on. And then I'm going to start at the thorax part, or just sort of halfway between the eye of the hook and the point. And I'm going to put dubbing on, and I'm going to roll it on fairly tight. But unlike normally when you put dubbing on a thread, when you're wrapping from the back to the front, you start skinny at the back and then make the noodle fatter as you get to the front. But we're going to do this in the inverse. We're going to start with thicker dubbing at the front and wrap backwards. So I'm going to make my dubbing rope so that it's a little thicker when I first make the first few wraps, and it's gradually going to thin out towards the end of the rope. You'll see why shortly. So because we're building this thorax backwards from the way one would almost normally do a thorax, we're going to try to stretch this out as we go further down the hook and taper the body as we get towards the back part of the bend, so that it gets a little skinnier the closer we get to the very end of the bend, all the way down until you're almost wrapping horizontally, making it a little tighter as we get further down. There we are, we're right down to the bottom. And we're going to take the last bits of dubbing off. And then we're going to use the thread, the tying thread, as the rib. We're going to rib through here with 5 or 6 wraps up the abdomen, all the way up to where we're going to stick the wing, which is there. Now, I got a little short on that, so I'm just going to add just a teeny bit of dubbing here, because I want to tie that snowshoe hair on right on top of the dubbing. So I'm going to leave my thread there. I'm going to get into the fur of this guy, and I'm going to try and snip out a bit of the hair from the very center of the foot. Hold on to the ends. Take a little clump out of there. And then I'm going to have to thin this out. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn it around so that the points are to my right. And then I'm going to hold it by the tips, and I'm going to pull a whole whack of that fluff out, the real short fluffy parts. And then you'll see I might have a few long stragglers at the front, but this particular foot, they're not bad. I'm going to measure this so that the wing of the thing is roughly shank length, he says. Well, I'm going to measure a little longer than shank length because I like a little taller wing on these things, proportion-wise. I'm going to set that right down on top of the dubbing where my thread is, and do a pinch wrap right over top. Couple of good solid wraps behind. And then I'm going to pull up the front, and I'm going to wrap in front of it right up against that puff of fur till it almost stands up. Then I'm going to come in behind and trim, not completely off, but trim off that little bit of excess. Now you can see I'm going to leave that little bit there. It sort of still makes part of that wing. Helps float the fly, I think. I'm going to stand that pretty much straight up as best I can. And I'm going to take the thorax dubbing, which is this chocolate brown. And I'm going to, again, a little bit of dubbing wax helps with this spiky hairs here on the thread. And I'm going to just make a fairly fine noodle of dubbing here, because all I'm going to do with this is just get under the underside of that wing a little bit with a really fine noodle, and wrap in behind, one wrap in behind the wing. And then I'm going to wrap in front of the wing, tight enough to try and force that wing part to stand up, and make a bit of a thorax that's a bit thicker than the abdomen. And then I'm going to make a little bit of a head out of dubbing there, if I can find some more. Just enough to make a bit of a thorax and head. And try and thin it down as I get towards the eye. So I'm not going to put too much dubbing up next to the eye. And then I'm going to make sure I get space behind the eye to whip finish. And I'm going to come in and do a whip finish right behind the eye. And as Florin does for these ones, I don't want to put any glue on this to mat down the fibers. So I'm going to just do 2 whip finishes. And cut the thread. And that's line number 1.
I'd like to make some comments. One thing is getting the fur off the bottom of the hare's foot is difficult. That hair is in there really thick, and you're trying hard with your scissors to try to clip horizontally or whatever. It's a real difficult. So the very first thing I do when I get a hare's foot is I cut it in half. And
that's what Bob Wyatt does.
It's bone. There's bone there, so you have to get your wire snippers. So I would cut it right transversely, cut it in half, and then you can start right at the where you've cut, and then you're cutting horizontally.
Yeah.
So because otherwise you're certainly when you're starting, it's really difficult to get a horizontal cut.
Yeah. Once you get the first little bit in the middle, I find it's not too bad. But I saw what Bob Wyatt did. He shaved off the side and both sides to take that shaved side off and the back. So all he had was the under fur sticking up like that.
Yeah.
But
I just cut it right in half. Yeah. And then I just find it so much easier.
And there's little color variations in these feet too. You can get dyed ones. But I find once I get that first cut in there, then it's not so bad to get a good cut out of it.
Yeah.
But you may be right, Ron. I've never tried to cut one of these in half.
So the other thing is that it's a kind of a generic pattern. You can do all kinds of things with it. And very often I don't, and when I tie the hair in, I don't trim the ends back as much as you did there. I don't know if you can see this, but you can see that I actually use the butts to make a thorax.
Yeah.
So I just, I don't really make a thorax except with the butts of the hair, and so that avoids a couple of steps. The other thing is the wing should go ahead of the hook. The way you've tied it is upright, but I find that the fly does much better with the body underwater, like it's a true emerger. So you want that
tilted forward a bit.
Tilted forward. So again, very often I do tie nothing ahead of the wing. I don't make a head or anything like that. I mean, to me, this is like a 2-minute fly. Doesn't take very long to do because I lose a lot on them where I'm fishing in New Zealand because I'm fishing in the willows and casting between willow branches, and there could be just as you think you made the perfect cast, to be a gust of wind, and there you are. It's in the willow branch, or whatever. So the bodies I make from a variety of materials. And on the Matara River, which there's a mayfly hatch of, number 18 flies, and they, for some reason, the trout eat them like chironomids. I mean, it's a dense hatch, an incredibly dense hatch, and they're just vacuuming them off the surface. It's just amazing. So this body is basically thread.
Mm.
You want it. You want it to break the surface and drop down. So I do make them with dubbed bodies. I do make them with a kind of vinyl, whatever it is, vinyl rib material, and I've made them with peacock herl. There's I mean, to me, it's a kind of a generic pattern.
Yeah.
The advantage of these is that they float. And these little rainbows I catch in the local lakes, they just inhale. I mean, half the time that the fly is way down in their throat. Jeez, it just drives me nuts. And I use that Kitchen hook, the fly removal. Yeah. But even so, the thing is, with a deer hair emerger, it is slimed or whatever. But with the snowshoe hair emerger, it's dry. Yeah, just a couple of false casts and it'll float again. Mind you, the deer hair emerger, I think, is more effective. But some of those hatches only last an hour, and if you're spending half your time trying to tie other flies on and this kind of thing, just wait. The other, just take a moment here. The other, that hare's foot material is incredible floating material. So I use it to tie another fly called the usual or hair stack.
The usual is the one I know it by.
Yeah. And it floats like a cork, using that, and it's basically two materials, red thread and hare's foot hair. And it's a very deadly fly too.
Good. Well, we'll now move on to fly number 2, which is basically, like you say, very similar fly. It's an emerger style pattern intended to float in the surface film with the butt of the fly dinging down below the surface film, which is basically the same principle behind the clinkhammer dry flies. Is
Dave,
to have
can I
the
break in for a minute here?
Yeah.
I was looking for a source of the rabbit for snowshoe and apparently the two guys that used to market this material no longer are doing so. And the only place I could find it was Stockard. Like I talked to the guys that ran Superfly, and they were telling me, said, boy, if you can get your hands on some, you better do it now because it's going to be long gone unless somebody starts up doing it again. So anybody's looking for a source of this material, you better start looking now. And number 2, I use the usual, and I'll tell you, it's replaced virtually all the dry flies in my box. It's good stuff.
Yeah. Oh, another one to try on another day.
2 weeks ago, I bought a hare's foot in Robinson's, and it was the last one, unfortunately. Yeah. But it was Spirit River was the name on the bag.
Anyway, for this one, we're using for this one now, the deer hair one. We're going to use deer hair. This is a nice little patch, and this is the stuff I found recently at Robinson's. It's Nature's Spirit. It's ex caddis deer, And the nice thing about it is it's short and it's quite fine, which makes it really easy to pick out and not a lot of fluff underneath. So it makes it easy to pick out the size of clump that you want, and without it being too long and too bulky for this size of fly. So the thread is 6/0 brown, and I'm going to start again at the eye of the hook. And I'm going to make sure I wrap a good underbody of thread right underneath here, because that's where the deer hair is going to go. And I don't want the deer hair to spin around the hook when I tie it on. So I'm going to make sure it's got the hook shank covered. Then I'm going to wrap the thread, and you'll see I've got a very long tag end of thread here. There's a reason for that. So I'm going to wrap this all the way down over top of the tag. And I'm going to wrap it right down to the bend again, so that we have this trailing body that's well below the water line. And I'm going to take the tag and put it in my material clip at the back. And then I'm going to come back up, and I'm going to start there, and I'm going to put my abdomen on, and I'm using again this Hairtron blend, which is hare's ear and antron. And I think you're right, you could use a variety of materials for the abdomen. This is a light olive color, and again I'm going to start with a very fine, with some wax first, a little bit of wax on my fingers and stuff here. And I'm going to start with a very fine dub body at the bottom, quite slender, and gradually make it fatter as I go up the abdomen of the fly, to try to get that tapered look to it. And again, that first wrap is skinny, and then gradually it's going to get a little thicker as I go up. And again, I might have to add a little bit of dubbing to get that abdomen a little bit thicker as I get closer to the. Now, another thing I found with this particular pattern is you don't want to crowd the eye a whole lot. So I'm going to stop the abdomen when I get basically so when the thread hangs down, it's going to be just in front of the hook point. And right in front of there is where I'm going to tie the wing. Now for the wing, I'm going to use this deer hair. I'm going to take out a small clump from the base, cutting it right down tight to the skin. And that's probably too much, but it's going to get thinned out as I go. So I'm just going to try and downsize the clump a bit, so that when I've got it crunched together, it's kind of gap width. I'm going to hold it up and move all the fluff from underneath just by holding the tips and flapping at it like that. And I'm going to turn it over and pull out any long ones just to make it easier to stack. I have a very nice hair stacker. As I've probably said to you guys before, this used to belong to Roman Sheriban, a fly tying friend of mine and a longtime guide on the Crow's Nest River. I bought it from his estate sale. Roman every time I tie these small deer hair flies. And I'm going to hold it so that when I take the deer hair out of the stacker. The tips are to my right hand, which is my tying hand. Hold it by the tips. Now again, I'm going to measure that wing, and I'd say almost the whole shank length, because I want this to be a little bit taller wing. I'm going to place it right over top of my thread, just so the thread is buried in my thumb and forefinger. I'm going to do this pinch wrap up in between the thumb and forefinger, down the far side, gentle pull, up in between again to the back, and pull up, and while squeezing the deer hair down the far side, all the way to the back, and pull up again. And you can see when I did that, that I've got two solid wraps in behind the deer hair. Then I'm going to pull that deer hair wing up, do a couple of wraps in front to make it stand up out of the way. And take my scissors, and I'm going to lay them down on top of the thorax and in between the upright deer hair, and slide it up as far as I can get and snip off the waist. And once again, get in here and try and trim that fairly short. Don't want too many sticking out the back there. I'm going to try to get that as short up to the thread as I can. And I'm going to bind those butts down, so it's not going to come out. Once again, pull the deer hair up, and again, I think like Ron says, leave them tipping forward slightly. Now I'm going to take this bit of thread at the back. I'm just going to get my bobbin out of the way here with my bobbin rest. And I'm going to wrap around to make the rib with this darker thread. I'll make several wraps up here. And then I'm going to get in front of that wing, and I'm going to wrap 2 or 3 times in front of the wing, trying to keep the wing out of the way. And I'm going to tie that down with my bobbin tying thread. This is always a little tricky to keep from trapping too many fibers off the wing. Trim that rib thread I used for the rib out of there. Stroke all those deer hair fibers back. Then I'm going to bring the thread just in behind the wing to where the thorax ended. Now I got some stragglers I kind of trapped there when I brought the thread through, the ribbing through. So I'm going to get rid of them now so they don't stick out too far later. This is just being picky about stuff that's in the way. Then I'm going to take the slightly darker material, which is again hare's ear and Antron mix. And this one I'm going to make just a little bit more fluffy, more spiky. I'm not going to do it really tight. Small, but not spun on there really hard. So a relatively narrow noodle, but not pinch down quite as hard as I did the abdomen. I'm gonna make a couple of wraps in behind just to cover up the tag end of those bits of deer hair. And then underneath and underneath, and take the last little bit off. Problem with this is try not to crowd the eye if you can avoid it.
Really cheaply made.
Make sure the in behind the eye is clear, and do again 2 whip finishes with the dark thread. Gives a little contrast. Then I can trim that off. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to flatten this wing out horizontally so that it's sort of a fan shape. And there you have it. And you can see what I mean by a fan shape by looking at this guy. It's narrow sidewise, but fan shaped that way.
That, go ahead.
And that's him.
The best deer hair I've found for that this particular fly is actually our local coastal deer hair.
Yep.
And it's the calabetus, which is the mayfly that hatches on our local lakes. It's sometimes called the speckle wing. And I think that coastal deer hair imitates the wing incredibly well. One of the problems I've had with the fly is sometimes it will land in the water on its head, upside down. And that just drives me nuts. Of course, it's right when you've cast to a fish. And what I think that's usually caused by the wing being too long. So I'll just take my scissors and cut back the wing a little bit if that happens. But it'll also happen if the wing is tied too close to the eye of the hook. Here's what I bought in Robinson's, they say just 2 weeks ago. And it's by Nature Spirit, Snowshoe Rabbit.
Yep.
And $10. When I think of the number of snowshoe hares that I snared as a kid or shot, God, I'd have made a fortune. But anyway.
Yeah, Ron, I agree with you. It's only had we known, man.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I don't think you're allowed to snare them in BC, but as a kid in New Brunswick, I snared so many.
I have to laugh because I think if I ever got really short of snowshoe hair feet, I would tell my daughter to kill the ones that hide under the spruce tree in front yard in Edmonton. Give me some feet.
That hair-tron material is a magical material.
Yeah.
And in New Zealand, where you can use 2 flies, if there's a good hatch and I'm not catching flies on the snowshoe hair emerger, I will tie the simplest little hair-tron nymph behind it. This is just made out of hair-tron. Dubbed with a thick near the eye to make kind of a thorax. And I'll have that maybe hung 4 to 6 inches off the snowshoe hair emerger. And it is an absolutely deadly fly. I mean, and again, you'll just see the snowshoe hair just kind of disappear under the surface and you're into a fish.
So there we go. That's the 2 emerger patterns. And Now Florin is going to get us the nymph patterns that are precede the emerger. They're fairly simple patterns as well. And I think, Florin, you said they were from Phil Rowley's book?
Yeah, that's where I got my initial inspiration from. Now you'll see they're fairly generic patterns, and he doesn't claim them as his own. So there are just, you know, variations on the good old hare's ear theme, and they're a fairly generic kind of attractor. So here's a hare's ear, right? These you'll find these patterns also when people start talking about flimps, which is, I don't know, some kind of a weird word concocted from fly and nymph.
I don't know, honey. I'm just in my Zoom meetings.
And so anyway, gold bead in both patterns, a dubbed body, a rib of something flashy, and then partridge for tail and collar. You can substitute marabou, or I've experimented with a few other things. I have something called chickaboo from a number of years ago, and it's dyed olive, and it looks a little bit like this. So this is the dyed olive chickaboo tail with a dyed olive partridge hackle. Okay, so I'm going to do quickly a couple of these in size 10 to give you an idea of what the fly is like. And it's, again, it's a fairly simple pattern like the ones Dave just demonstrated. So 1/8 bead, 9671 masthead hook. So kind of, you know, your standard nymph hook setup. 8/0 olive thread. You can use tan, whatever. And get to the tying point for the tail, and then get from a feather off the partridge's back, you get these really beautiful feathers. Just get a clump of fibers for the tail. Okay. So attach the tail fibers. Trim the waist, and now attach the rib. Now this is at a funny angle because it's a rotary vise. If I let it hang, it just hangs like this. But for me to see it face on, because it's fairly low, I'm just going to put it at a 45-degree angle. I'm still tinkering with the adjustments here. Okay, so attach the rib. And in this case, I'm just going to leave it to just a plain gold. You can mix with the gold, you can do a double ribbing. You can use a strand of crystal flash, rib one way, and then counter rib with the gold, or you can just use the gold. So here I'm going to do the plain vanilla one with gold only. And then for dubbing, I'm just using hare's ear that I prepared myself. And it's kind of a medium tan color. Just spin it on the thread. And here you can sort of decide how spiky you want this thing. And this is fairly loosely dubbed here. Okay, so I'm going to start wrapping the dubbed thread. And always those first few wraps behind are, whoops, a little tricky. Because I'm still not quite fully used to when I'm gonna hit the hook point. So there you go. All right. I probably need just a little dab more of dubbing. There's enough weight here. I can also leave the vise unlocked. It seems to hold okay. Okay, so this is nice and spiky. One quick half hitch and time for the ribbing. And now I'm going to have to make a decision as to whether I want to let me wind the ribbing up in the opposite direction so it stands out a little bit more. Hopefully that's visible there. And here we are. I'm going to lock it again so I can secure this firmly. Just to be on the safe side, this is actually gold tinsel kind of thread that I got from a sewing shop a while back. And it's fairly easy to lose to separate the core from the rest of it. So that was the sound of my whip finisher hitting the floor. Okay. All right, time for the hackle, which is partridge. First, I'm going to retrieve my whip finisher from under the desk. Okay. So for the partridge here, I have a fairly smallish hackle. That's already prepared. And I'm going to attach it by the tip, kind of tie it the standard fashion. So it goes up here. Actually, those extra fibers can pretty much be left in place. They don't, in this case, maybe they're a bit too much. I'm just going to trim them, but otherwise you can almost just leave them there. They just blend in with the rest of the mess. You're not going to notice them. Okay. I'm going to wrap the hackle, and I have found that partridge is got really fine stems and they slip out fairly easily from a lot of hackle pliers. And I've been experimenting with this wire concoction, which I bought a number of years ago. And I think it's become a little bit more widely available now. And it does grip the hackle rather well. So you have to be careful not to break the hackle. And earlier on, I experimented with just grabbing a strand of 8/0 thread with this thing, and it held quite well. So I can say I'm starting to use this a little bit more on a lot of situations where the slipperiness of the material creates problems. So here the only important thing is when you wrap partridge is that you do a bit of stroking back of those fibers so they don't all clump over each other. When you get to the end, just wrap over a couple of times in one direction, a couple more times in the other direction, then trim off the butts. Done. Okay, now there's still a little bit of a gap here behind the bead, and I'm going to fill that gap with another little bit of dubbing. Just a little pinch of dubbing on the thread. I'm going to actually rotate the hook so that I get a better sense of what's going on here. I can see better what's happening. And once I'm satisfied with the way the fly looks, lock the vise again and whip finish right behind the bead. And again, a couple of whip finishes is all that it takes. And that's fly number one. And basically you can take this idea of, you know, soft hackle for the tail and for the hackle, and just play with it in various color combinations, right? Just keep the gold bead basically, or go to copper if you prefer copper. Copper also makes very nice flies. Okay, so here's the olive colored version of this. Again, same size hook and bead. Move the thread to the tying point for the tail, and now I'm going to use, I have a partridge. It looks more brown here on the camera than on my desk. It's actually a dyed olive partridge skin. So I'm going to grab some fibers of from a similar feather as I did before. So something like this. And this one has an olive tinge to it. They're very fragile, so I have to be careful. Get a clump of fibers, pull them off the side of the feather, and attach them as a tail. I want a little bit more movement. So in Phil Rowley's book, the green-tailed version has a longish tail of green marabou. So you can, I'm going to mimic that look a little bit here by tying in a significantly longer tail. So something like this. You can probably see it better now. Okay. And then I'm going to go with 2 ribs on this fly. So I'm going to do a gold rib like I did before, which goes on first. This other stuff is going to be nicely caught under the dubbing, so I don't have to worry about trimming this little bit. And this is just some basic pearl crystal flash that will shine in various colors depending on the angle. It does give a little bit of a bluish color, so I'm thinking of trying some other crystal flash to see if I can get something a little bit more greenish in line with the rest of the fly. Okay, so then I have my 2 strands of ribbing. I have my gold here, and I have the crystal flash, and then I'm going to go and dab the body. I can use the same hare's ear that I did before. I've tied a few with some olive antron. I'm just going to go back to the hare's ear here. So again, tap the thread. This one I want a little bit tighter. What I have at the back of my mind is thoughts of damsels. Okay, maneuver around that hook point. Okay. So that's the dub body. Put the thread out of the way and do the first rib, which is going to be the crystal flash. Okay. Now the crystal flash, I'm going to rib one way and the gold wire the other way. So here goes the crystal flash first. And you can see the sort of color you get out of that. It looks pretty nice and enticing. Now one more half hitch so I can do the other. Whoops, I just broke my thread. Brilliant. Let me save this quickly here. I'm going to quickly knot. I'll take care of that. Now I have to rewind. Redo the bobbin. Oh well. It's almost $100 to buy a second bobbin, so I'm hesitating a little. Ideally, I would have a second one threaded close by and ready to go. Oh well. By the end of summer, I should probably have a second bobbin sitting here. Only one doesn't do very well. It's a slippery slope, as you probably know already. Okay, so let's reattach that thread. I was going to do a little half hitch. And probably I hit the thread with the tips of my scissors. Okay, and now the gold rib is going to go the same direction as the thread, which is opposite of the direction I was going with the crystal flash. So there we are. Lock the vise and secure that tinsel properly. Trim it off and hackle time. Now for the hackle on this one, I want a matching olive hackle from the same olive skin. So I'm just going to grab one here that looks nice. Yeah, this is a little bit like the Snowshoe Hair story. I'm looking at partridge skins in the store these days and I'm scratching my head at the prices. When I bought my partridge, you could buy multiple colors. There were $30 to $40 a skin. There was no reason not to buy several partridge skins, and now it's like, huh? Do I want to? Yeah. Okay. So there goes the partridge. So a little bit too long, so I'm going to trim it off. There's another stray fiber right here.
You need a friend who shoots Hungarian partridge. They're in Alberta.
Yeah, I know they're here. It's just they're not dyed olive when you shoot them. I have to take the plunge into some dyeing anyway. I'm going to try to dye some polar bear and see how that goes.
With Kool-Aid?
No, I'm going to try actual proper dyes because polar bear is enough of an exotic, expensive material that I don't want to take too many chances. I've started to look up, wool shops and stuff like that tend to supply this kind of stuff. So I think that dyes that are being used for natural fibers like wool and alpaca and whatnot, well, and also have some pretty nice local alpaca that I bought as a, loose, they have a name for it. I can't remember what it's called now, but it's basically just loose fiber. And it's kind of an off-white color, and it looks to me like it's perfect for dubbing. Experiment with some of those things. Okay, and then just a little bit of cleanup here at the head. A little bit of dubbing. Here you have to be careful. It's not too much, and you're not wrapping it too far back, because the risk is you're matting down the partridge fibers, and that's not what you want. You just want to close that little gap. Okay, that's basically the fly. Now it just remains to whip finish. And before I say it's done, I better hang my automatic bobbin away. And there it is. This is the damsel version of it. You can see it's basically the same fly as before with just a slight variation in materials. Okay. And you can do these things in sizes 10 to 14, 16 if you like, and they cover a range of insects depending on how slender and fat and how big or thin you make those tails, how long and short and so on. So there we are.
Thank you, Soren.
Nice fly.
And for those of you tying rotary, I know there are two people on the show today. Here's a little trick that I found works for keeping your ribbing on the spool if you like to tie off spool without cutting it off. So let me refocus the camera here a little bit. Okay. So Ron, you'd probably recognize this as a Norvise.
Yeah.
And you'd recognize this as one of those little magnets that are available in a variety of places. Well, by having my ribbing material on one of these little metallic spools, it stays there, and I don't have to clip off any length of material. And what step 2 of this procedure is going to be is to basically take a bolt of some kind that has a good diameter to fit inside a regular spool of thread, and have it basically as a bobbin holder that would then get easily attached to the magnet, which can sit anywhere on the jaws. Of course, the rest of it is useless. The hub here is brass, so no magnet is going to stick to this. You'd have to attach something to it. And the arm here, the rest of the arm is aluminum, so that's also useless. But the jaws are nice and solid, they contain enough iron to hold a magnet well. So this was just a little thing that I found to be very handy when tying with this vise, which I'm just in the process of learning how to operate properly. That was my tip of the day. Well, that and these hackle pliers,
Oh,
which
fluorite.
look very funny, but they work better than they look.
Yeah, the alternative to those guys is these guys. I don't know if you can see them. They're
Yeah, the
called
electronics ones.
they're called test clips. They're hard to come by unless you're into the electronics business. They're available from an outfit called DigiKey. And I bought some stuff from DigiKey not that long ago. And their delivery was fabulous, like 3 days. These guys are about $4 a piece. So I happen to have an inventory of them from some time back when I was doing a bunch of electronics work.
I bought a bunch of small ones from China through AliExpress.
Yeah, that would work too.
Virtually nothing.
Yeah.
But they are great. I use them for a lot of different purposes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the only issue with those is that with these you can still put your finger through, like with the old English hackle pliers. With those other ones, you'd have to make an attachment yourself for that purpose. Yeah.
I for just a few minutes ago found Bob Wyatt's book that I had. I didn't know where it was, and I just was going through it, and that little fly, that little subsurface nymph is one of his patterns. He calls it a wee hair emerger, and he's a Canadian.
Is that the What Trout Want is the title?
Yeah, what trout want.
Oh, okay. Thank
Yeah.
you.
I think his DVDs are what flies that catch fish, or some kind of a title like that. You know, he believes in simplistic, impressionistic flies, and he is a Canadian. He might even be from Alberta. I'm not even sure.
He is from Alberta. He says in the book somewhere something about his childhood fishing experiences in Alberta.
Yeah. I know he's tied a herring imitation that he's used in our coastal waters. But I think he spends a lot of his time in New Zealand. I also, when I found this other book called The Soft Hackled Fly Addict by Sylvester Neames. And so, I mean, it's kind of splitting hairs as to whether some of these flies are nymphs or soft hackles or flimps. I think flimps is, I forget what the name is for those words that you combine something like nymph and wet fly. So you call it flimps. But he has a lot of patterns in there, and basically he uses them downstream, often with a kind of licensing lift, that kind of thing at the end, where you at the end of the drift you raise your rod.
Yep.
Deadly flies. And again, in New Zealand, where you can use a team of flies, sometimes during the middle of the day when there are no hatches and so on, and I'll use a team of three of them. The bottom one will be a weighted nymph, probably a heron copper, and then two wet hackles, soft hackles.
So this is what happens when you start tying flies to instruct for goldenrods. You end up buying the box of goldenrods, and you end up filling it with patterns that you've tied in order to get ready for this deal.
Yeah.
Nice little box for the price of $10.
Yeah.
Yeah, I bought two.
So
I'm glad it has. you've attached it to something, have you?
Yeah, it comes with a little lanyard.
Yeah, that's great, you know.
Yeah, I attached mine to the jacket just in case.
Yeah.
I think I'm gonna do a box with a bunch of cutthroat flies on this thing. I'm gonna search through my boxes and fill them with some cutthroat flies. Because a couple of guys with Haig Brown want to go down and fish the gorge next week.
That's a lot.
See if there's any cutties around.
Okay. I was at walking the dogs at the gorge, and there was a lot of little silver fish jumping out all over the place. What would they be?
Fry, maybe even coho. They'll be coming out of the Colquitts and whatever that other river is.
Craig flower, yeah.
Yeah, they're probably on their way out.
Yeah, they were really small, maybe
Yep.
3-4 inches.
Yep.
There'll be fry or smolts of one salmon species or another. Most likely, I would think.
Interesting. Well, there were a lot of
Possibly some immature herring as well.
I'm surprised you didn't see some cutties chasing them.
No, I didn't see anything like that.
Anyway, I think it's worth a go.
There was a heck of a lot of them.
What would you think they were, Michael?
You're muted, Michael.
Chum fry, maybe. You would think the coho smolts would be a little bigger since they spend a year in the river.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So we that gives rise to my thought for next week, and I was sort of thinking about little minnow patterns that could be tied fairly small. And what came to my mind, which we haven't done, is the old zonker. Just with a rabbit strip and a mylar body, and you can tie those on relatively small hooks with a small mylar tube. So I'm going to scout around and see what I have for mylar tubing and for smaller rabbit strips, and see if I can tie us up with a zonker next week.
That could be a good one.
Yeah. Put a little lead weight under them to get them down quick, and again, depending on the size of the mylar tubing, you could probably tie those down onto a size 8 or 10 3x long hook. Keep them relatively small.
You know, talking about New Zealand, a silver and pearl zonker, deadly in Lake Taupo on big rainbows.
You know why? You know why they're?
Yeah, whitefish.
They have
smelt.
Smelt,
yeah.
Yeah. And the other one that works really well in Taupo is if you want to go out and try some night fishing, you use what's called a lumo fly, which has got some luminescent plastic that you tie on as the body material, and then put some sort of wing on it, and you energize it with your flashlight and chuck it out into the surf in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
That was my first experience fishing Lake Taupo, was with one of the guys from Hamilton. We went down there and we arrived in Taupo to stay overnight, and about 9:30, and he looks at me and he says, "So, you want to go fishing?" So we drove down to the Tarangi Taupo, and there I was in the dark with a little sliver of a moon walking out on this gravel bar in between the river and the lake.
Yeah.
Landed 2 8-pound rainbows that night.
Yeah, that's deadly.
Is there any alternative to using lead?
Lead for?
Well, for weighting your flies.
You can get a lead-free wire.
Yeah.
It's pretty crappy. I would use tungsten beads if I want weight.
Yeah, beads work if you've got a place to put beads, but if you're going to underwrap, you can get good sized lead-free wire now.
Expensive.
It's not cheap. Yeah.
But with Tony.
Trying to keep lead out of our waters.
Yeah.
Well, the biggest problem with lead in our waters is split shot and buckshot.
Yeah.
It gets in the birds because they feed off the bottom. I don't know that it gets into the ecosystem via fish ingestion. I think it just, if you got lead that goes to the bottom of the typical lakes around here, it would stay there forever.
Yeah.
But split shots, you know, particularly in a stream, they'd end up rolling around the bottom and they get picked up. And of course, bird shot is the real problem with lead.
Yeah.
Well, I know a friend of mine belonged to the Caledon Fishing Club, and they have a shooting range.
Mhm.
And the tests on the grounds of the soil and so on, that thing's been there for 50 years. And the soil around there for about a half a mile is completely and absolutely polluted.
Yeah.
Really badly. I mean, can you imagine 50 years worth of skeet shooting?
I think if you're hunting migratory birds, you have to use lead-free shot, but you can still use them for upland birds.
And well, anytime you shoot over water, you have to use steel shot.
Yeah, that's been for about 10 years now.
Yeah.
You know, just a side issue, the mouth of the Goldstream River, that nature house used to be the Victoria Fish and Game clubhouse, and they had a skeet operation there, right out over the flats. I tell you, it used to be a great place to fish for sea run cutthroat at the mouth of the Goldstream.
Only trouble is you eat them, you start glowing after a while.
Oh yeah. Don't want to eat them.
So I don't know. I think I'll do a zonker and I'll put some lead-free wire under it just to give it a little bit of heft. Don't want to
Cheaper
be too
to get
heavy.
the lead-free wire is the lead-free lead line trolling line.
Yeah, that would work too.
Yeah, that might work.
Yeah, it's probably tungsten in the middle of that.
Yeah, and it's cheap. It's like $30, 100 yards.
Yeah.
What was that again?
The lead-free lead trolling wire. Remember the old trolling lines, the lead? Same thing, but lead-free.
Yeah, you don't want to make it too heavy or you end up smacking yourself in the back of the head.
Oh boy, done that a couple of times.
Well, even worse is hitting your rod.
Yeah.
That's a great, I mean, most of us, our heads will heal, although my wife wonders sometimes whether mine is healed. But boy, one way to break a rod is to nick it with a heavy fly. The next fish you fight, it'll snap right there.
It doesn't even have to be heavy. It depends on the weight of your rod.
Yeah.
First time I fished the Tarangi River was with a heavy weight, what they call the bomb at the bottom of the rig. Only hit myself in the back twice, but boy, it's smart.
That night fishing, Dave, has claimed a lot of lives.
Oh yeah, it would be easy.
Yeah, they you're supposed to fish the flow of the streams that go into the lake, but Lake Taupo is the core of an old volcano, and it's really steep. There's a very little shore, and people like to. I mean, the best nights to fish it are moonless nights, really dark nights.
Well, we had moon, so
yeah, and people stumble or go, and they try to swim back, and they're swimming back against the flow of the stream, and they exhaust themselves. They'd be far better off just going with the flow and then swimming. back, but they pen at night. You know, you can be, you know, in waist deep water and you're within 2 feet of it, you know,
Yeah.
20 feet or more of water.
Yeah, 2 feet either side of that gravel ridge, and
Yeah.
you're in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I only did that once.
Yeah.
We did fish at night up in one of the big impoundments on the upper end of the Tongariro,
Yeah.
but that was from shore.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty spot. We camped there for 3 nights.
Oh, isn't it?
It was really pretty.
Yeah.
That was before we got sent back home for COVID.
You and I must have been there just about the same time.
Yeah.
I came back
year,
March 15th.
I think we might have been on the same flight, Ron.
Yeah, yeah. Well, a whole bunch of people. I mean, 2 of my patients were on that flight, and they were, you know, afraid to get back. They wouldn't get back into Canada.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, we're hoping as soon as COVID lets up that we're gonna head down there within the next 6 months to a year of the borders getting wide open. We got some people to visit. As a matter of fact, my wife's colleague and friend phoned her from Hamilton, from Raglan Harbor for her birthday the other day. Had a 40-minute phone call with Jackie, and she says, you know, as soon as this COVID lets us, I want to get out of here. I'm going to come and see you guys.
You know, of course, it's a fantastic fishing year in New Zealand. I mean, it's a mouse year. You know, that every few years there's a kind of a peak of the mouse population, and I think it has to do with also with the beech trees. They produce something that mice thrive on, and that mouse fishing at night in New Zealand is well, even during the day, you know, but at night in the rivers.
Kamchatka was amazing for the mouse fishing. I mean, I think I used nothing but mice the one day. And it was literally not every cast, but every second or third cast was a fish. And they're fun to fish, those mice.
Yeah, yeah.
Hey, if you want a real adrenaline surge, you want to go to the Shotover River and go for a jet boat ride. I've never experienced anything like that.
Yeah, that's just out of Queenstown, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Hey, he's got to the Sustit. They only used jet boats up there.
Yeah, but it's nothing like the Hamilton jets, which was developed, invented in New Zealand. But those guys, they skim right over islands and all kinds of things.
Yeah. But they have that falls, the outflow from Taupo, which is like impressive enough just to look at.
Yeah.
But they have those jet boat guys who go down the bottom, take, you know, the tourists.
What was really cool was to go down by the pool at the base of the dam where when the horn goes off and then the water comes over the spillway.
Yeah.
But when you're standing there watching before that happens, because it happens on every hour or so, you can look in that great big pool and you can see these giant trout in there, and they can hear the horn because then they go and hide. They know the water's coming.
Well, that whole area was spectacular. I mean, because you could go to some of the parks and the river would be flowing through it, and you could literally sight fish the trout. I didn't have a rod, so we weren't fishing, but could see all kinds of trout in the river.
You know, I read an article a number of years ago saying Lake Taupo was the most productive trout water in the world. The highest nutrient level.
Well,
it has when the rainbow trout run up the Tongariro, it is just an unbelievable number of fish. It's just,
and they're big. They're, you know, between 6 and 10 pounds. They're big fish and strong.
still the best, in my opinion, humble opinion. Lake Strobel has the biggest and most numerous rainbow trout in the world. They're huge.